This is another representation of a story. It's a simple story. I think it's one that's really most applicable to children at... There are aspects of it that are most applicable to children. Sexual desire one obviously isn't. It's a map of motivation. It basically says this, and it's easy to understand if you think, you go to a movie, doesn't matter what country it's made, there's certain things that always happen, right? Like two broad classes of fiction, adventure and romance. What's an adventure? To go to new lands and discover something new and become transformed as a consequence. What's a romance? To meet another person who's certainly as complicated as anything you could meet on an adventure, and again to be transformed as a consequence of the contact. Two fundamental plots. Why? Why are there fundamental plots? And why can we understand them without them being explained to us? Well, it's because fundamentally we're all very, very similar. We have a finite set of basic needs. So for example, hot people would rather be cool. Thirsty people would rather have water. Hungry people would rather eat. And these motivations color what we conceive of as our ultimate destiny. So in the Old Testament, for example, an agrarian community, often hungry, paradise was construed as the land of milk and honey. Well, why? Well, milk is high in fat and honey is high in glucose, and if you're hungry, really hungry, there's nothing you want more than fat and sugar. Affiliative desire. We like to be around other people. Sexual desire. A fundamental sub-element of a romantic plot. These underlying motivational systems of ours set us up bounded worlds within which we live. So for example, if you fall in love with someone and you construe your destiny as being with them, any indication that they're pleased with you is going to produce a rush of positive emotion. Why? Because our emotional systems are set up so that any sign that we're moving towards our goal is responded to with a rush of positive emotion. And conversely, a frown from the person that you love, especially in the initial stages of a romance, is met with a flood of negative affect. Why? Because anything that stops us on the path that we've chosen produces negative emotion. That's how we're set up. And our emotional systems are actually quite straightforward. We posit a goal. The thing about people is that we can posit virtually anything as a goal. That's one of the things that distinguishes us from animals. So we can all be thrilled to death when our favorite soccer team scores a goal, because we participate in what they're doing the same way we participate in watching a protagonist on a movie or in a book. We can feel it. We embody it. We even know now that the neural systems that I utilize to watch a movie involve the same neural systems that the actor is utilizing acting out the part. So when you say you understand someone else, what you mean is your body is set to do exactly the same thing their body is, and your emotional systems are locked on exactly the same way theirs are. So when they experience something and you're watching it, you experience an echo of it, and that's what understanding means. And it turns out as well that those neural systems that allow us to embody someone else and to imitate them are right underneath the structures that we've evolved to use for language. And what that indicates is that mostly what we use language for is to tell stories. To tell stories about the way that people act, so that we can derive information, not about what the world's made of, because we don't really care about that in some fundamental way, but instead, how should we act? That's the fundamental question. How should we act? Now, if you go see a movie about a thug, the message there is, given that the thug generally comes to not so good end, don't act like a thug, right? Interesting though it might be, compelling as a lifestyle, at least sufficiently compelling so you'll watch it, it's not a good long-term strategy. What is a good long-term strategy? You know, we've been collecting stories as people for, we don't know how long, really. We don't know. 100,000 years maybe. There's been creatures like us, indistinguishable from us, for 100,000 years. And we know that societies that appear to be more or less as archaic as those old societies tell stories, have rituals, have mythology. We have ancient written stories, like the Ünlü Elish, which is a Sumerian story, the oldest written story we have, 4,000 years old, based on an oral tradition that's probably 20,000 years older than that. We've been collecting stories for a long, long time. What do they mean? What are they good for? Well, imagine this, you know, you tell a story to your husband or your wife, about something interesting that you saw, right? Well, then imagine that you could collect 1,000 of the most interesting stories. And then imagine that you were some kind of literary genius like Shakespeare, and you could take those 1,000 interesting stories and boil them down to 100 really interesting stories. And then imagine that you had 10,000 years to gather up those 100 most interesting stories and average them, and you could come out with one perfect story, the best story, the most interesting story that you could possibly tell. Well, that's what a myth is. It's the most interesting story you can possibly tell. And just as this little story that I just told you had an underlying mythological structure, virtually every story you ever see has such a structure. That's why it's compelling to you. And when you meet someone who's charismatic or who holds your attention or who you're interested in, the probability that they're acting out a mythological fragment is very, very high. And that's why it is that your attention is captivated by them.